Hiber-Nation 44. Grizzly's Growls presents Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Monarch, the Big Bear of Tallac, by Ernest Thompson Seton, as read by David Grizzly Smith. Landlocked. That night the great bear left his lair, one of his many lairs, and cured of all his wounds. Rejoicing in the fullness of his mighty strength, he strode toward the plains. His nose, ever alert, reported sheep, a deer, a grouse, men, more sheep, some cows, some calves, a bull, a fighting bull. And Monarch wheeled in his big, rude, bearish joy in the coming battle brunt. But as he hugely hulked from hill to hill, a different message came. So soft and low, so different from the smell of beefish brutes, one might well wonder he could sense it, but like a tiny ringing bell when thunder booms it came, and Monarch wheeled at once. Oh, it cast its potent spell. It stood for something very near to ecstasy with him, and down the hill and through the pines he went, on and on, faster yet, abandoned to its sorcery. Here to its home he traced it, a long, low cavern. He'd seen such many times before, and been held in them more than once, but had learned to spurn them. For weeks he had been robbing them of their treasures, and its odor, like a calling voice, was still his guide. Into the cavern he passed, and it reeked with the smell of joy. There was the luscious mass, and Monarch, with all caution lulled now, licked, and seized to tear the bag for more, when down went the door with a low bang. The Monarch started, but all was still, and there was no smell of danger. He had forced such doors before. His palate craved the honey still, and he licked and licked, greedily at first, and then calmly, and then slowly, and then drowsily, and at last stopped. His eyes were closing, and he sank slowly down on the earth, and slept a heavy sleep. Calm but white-faced were they, the men, when in dawn they came. There were the huge scarred tracks in leading, and there was the door down, and there, dimly, they could see a mass of fur that filled the pen, that heaved in deepest sleep. Strong ropes, strong chains, and bands of steel were at hand, with chloroform, lest he should revive too soon. Through holes in the roof with infinite toil they chained him, bound him, his paws to his neck and breast and hind legs to a bolted beam. Then, raising the door, they dragged him out, not with horses, none would go near, but with a windlass to a tree, and, fearing the sleep of death, they let him now revive. Chained and double-chained, frenzied, foaming, and impotent, what words can tell the state of the fallen monarch? They put him on a sled, and 6 horses with long chain drew it by stages to the plain, to the railway. They fed him enough to save his life. A great steam derrick lifted bear and beam and chain onto a flat car. A tarpaulin was spread above his helpless form. The engine puffed out, and the grizzly king was gone from his ancient hills. So they brought him to the great city, the monarch born in chains. They put him in a cage, not merely strong enough for a lion, but thrice as strong, and once a rope gave way as the huge one strained his bonds. "He's loose," went the cry, and an army of onlookers and keepers fled. Only the small man with the calm eye and the big man of the hills were staunch. So the monarch was still held. Free in the cage, he swung around, looked this way and that, and then heaved his powers against the triple angling steel, and wrenched the cage so not a part of it was square. In time he clearly would break out. They dragged the prisoner to another that an elephant could not break down, but it stood on the ground, and in an hour the great beast had a cavern into the earth and was sinking out of sight, till a stream of water sent after him filled the hole and forced him again to view. They moved him to a new cage, made for him since he came, a hard rock floor, great bars of nearly 2-inch steel that reached up 9 feet and projected in for 5. The monarch wheeled once around, then, rearing, raised his ponderous bulk, wrenched those bars unbreakable, and bent and turned them in their sockets with one heave till the 5-foot spears were pointed out, and then sprang to climb. Nothing but pikes and blazing brands and a dozen ruthless hands could hold him back. The keepers watched him night and day till a stronger cage was made, impregnable, with steel above and rocks below. The untamed one passed swiftly around, tried every bar, examined every corner, sought for a crack in the rocky floor, and found at last the place where was a 6-inch timber beam, the only piece of wood in its frame. It was sheathed in iron, but exposed for an inch its whole length. One claw could reach the wood, and here he lay on his side and raked all day, till a great pile of shavings was lying by it, and the beam sawn in 2, but the cross-bolts remained, and when Monarch put his vast shoulder to the place, it yielded not a whit. That was his last hope. Now it was gone, and the huge bear sank down in the cage with his nose in his paws, and sobbed. Long, heavy sobs, animal sounds indeed, but telling just as truly as in man of the broken spirit, the hope and life gone out. The keepers came with food at the appointed time, but the bear moved not. They set it down, but in the morning it was still untouched. The bear was lying as before, his ponderous form in the pose he had first taken. The sobbing was replaced by a low moan at intervals. 2 days went by. The food, untouched, was corrupting in the sun. The 3rd day, and Monarch still lay on his breast, his huge muzzle under his huger paws. His eyes were hidden. Only a slight heaving of his broad chest was now seen. "He's dying," said one keeper. "He can't live overnight." "Send for Killian," said another. So Killian came, slight and thin, and there was the beast that he had chained, pining, dying. He had sobbed his life out in his last hope's death, and a thrill of pity came over the hunter for men of grit and power, love, grit, and power. He put his arm through the cage bars and stroked him, but Monarch made no sign. His body was cold. At length a little moan was a sign of life, and Killian said, "Here, let me go to him." "You're mad," said the keepers, and they would not open the cage. But Killian persisted until they put in a cross grating in front of the bear. Then, with this between, he approached. His hand was on the shaggy head, but Monarch lay as before. The hunter stroked his victim and spoke to him. His hand went to the big round ears, small above the head. They were rough to his touch. He looked again, and then started. "What? Is it true?" "Yes, the stranger's tale was true. For both ears were pierced with a round hole, one torn large, and Killian knew at once he had met his little Jack." "Why, Jackie, I didn't know it was you. I never would have done it I never would have done it if I knew it was you, Jackie. Jackie, old pa, don't you know me? But Jack stirred not, and Killian got up quickly. Back to the hotel he flew. There he put on his hunter's suit, smoky and smelling of pine gum and grease, and returned with a mass of honeycomb to re-enter the cage. Jackie, Jackie, honey, honey. And he held the tempting comb before him, but Monarch lay as one dead now. Jackie, Jackie, don't you know me? He dropped the honey and laid his hands on the great muzzle. The voice was forgotten. The old-time invitation, honey, Jackie, honey, had lost its power. But the smell of the honey, the coat, the hands that he had fondled had together a hidden potency. There is a time when the dying of our race there is a time when the dying of our race forget their life, but clearly remember the scenes of childhood. These only are real, and return with master power. And why not with a bear? And why not with a bear? The power of scent was there to call them back again, and Jackie, the grizzly monarch, raised his head a little, just a little. The eyes were nearly closed, but the big brown nose was jerked up feebly 2 or 3 times, the sign of interest that Jackie used to give in days of old. Now it was Killian that broke down. Now it was Killian that broke down, even as the bear had done. I didn't know it was you, Jackie. I didn't know it was you, Jackie, or I never would have done it. Oh, Jackie, forgive me. And he rose and fled from the cage. The keepers were there. They scarcely understood the scene, but one of them, acting on the hint, pushed the honeycomb nearer and cried, "Honey, Jackie, honey." Filled by despair, he had laid down to die. But here was a newborn hope, not clear, not exact, as words might put it. But his conqueror had shown himself a friend. This seemed a new hope, and the keeper, taking up the old call, "Honey, Jackie, honey," pushed the comb till it touched his muzzle. The smell was wafted to his sense. Its message reached his brain. Hope honored, it must awake response. The great tongue licked the comb, appetite revived, and thus, in newborn hope, began the chapter of his gloom. Skillful keepers were there with plans to meet the monarch's every want. Delicate foods were offered, and every shift was tried to tempt him back to strength and prison life. He ate and lived. And still he lives, but pacing, pacing, pacing. You may see him, scanning not the crowds, but something beyond the crowds, breaking down at times into petulant rages, but recovering anon his ponderous dignity, looking, waiting, watching, held ever by that hope, that unknown hope that came. Killian has been to him since, but Monarch knows him not. Over his head, beyond him, was the great bear's gaze, far away toward Tallac, or far away onto the sea, we know not which or why, but pacing, 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 held like the storied wandering one to a life of ceaseless journey, a journey aimless, endless, and sad. The wound spots long ago have left his shaggy coat, but the earmarks still are there, the ponderous strength, the elephantine dignity. His eyes are dull, never were bright, but they seem not vacant, and most often fixed on the Golden Gate, where the river seeks the sea. The river, born in high Sierra's flank, that lived and rolled and grew through mountain pines or leaping man-made barriers, then to reach with growing power the plains and bring its mighty flood at last to the Bay of Bays, a prisoner there to lie, the prisoner of the Golden Gate, seeking forever freedom's blue, seeking and raging, raging and seeking, back and forth, forever, in vain. Thank you for listening to Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Comment on the website at grizzliesgrowls.com. This program is offered under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.